Hey, fáilte fé gachaine die trasna na tíre há léocht den céad sco eile a gcuin a ríis de nocht hamid a brand nocht Archives and Amnesia, Unlocking Our Archives by Dr. Ciarán Wallace. Há Ciarán héis tactisteach an nocht agus hamid a súl go mór leis an gceann seán mar is tionscanal le é seo ó chláiste na trinód an Ryan Stara an sin in the Will Ciarán Port. So we're absolutely thrilled to welcome Ciarán on board tonight. This is one I've been really looking forward to with Archives and Amnesia, Unlocking Our Archives. And Ciarán Wallace is part of this amazing project that I think really deserves so much more spotlight. And tonight we're getting a platform to do that. So we're absolutely trusted here. Thrilled, Ciarán, to have you on board. So I'm going to hand it over to you. Any questions or comments you have, lads, during the whole thing, just pop them into the comments box and I'll ask Ciarán at the end. He's happy enough to do about 15 minutes of questions and answers. So by all means, drop them in there and we'll ask at the end. Okay, Ciarán, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thanks for the opportunity to present on the project. I was delighted to hear this was going on and delighted to get the invitation. So, and thanks for all the people who joined this evening. So, as Ben was saying, I am the Deputy Director with the Beyond 2022 project, which is a project that began in Trinity College, Dublin, about 2 years ago in a small scoping phase. And since then, we've grown and grown. We had an announcement last December where we got state funding from the Department of Culture as part of the Ireland Project 2040 funding. So now we have funding to run until the end of 2022 to build this project up, which I'll explain to you now. Before I start, a couple of things I just want to say. I'm going to give you in this talk the origins of the project and talk about sort of a forgotten institution, a forgotten building. At the end of the talk, I'll show you a slide which links to 2 online events that are happening on the 30th of June. I'll explain why 30th June is an important day for us. But 30th of June, if you're interested in hearing more or hearing some of our technological developments and archival discoveries, you're more than welcome to join us on a free online forum the 30th of June, lunchtime and evening time. And then there'll be further meetings going forward with our colleagues in PROI in Northern Ireland and in next summer in the National Archives in London. So we'll do as much online as we can. So the topic or the theme, which I'll just share my screen here now, the theme of today's of my talk this evening is archives and amnesia, and in a way that's kind of counterintuitive because archives, if you like, are about remembering, they're about recalling and recording, but I reckon that there's a kind of an amnesia has built in about Irish archives, which I just want to sort of touch on in the description this evening. In a sense, the archive is a site of memory. The archive is a place where we store things that need to be remembered for business reasons, for the reasons of state. But in this case, the Irish archival tradition had a huge sort of hole blown in it in 1922. And I think what's happened before that has been forgotten. But the good work that was done is still there, and we're building on that good work. So I want to talk, first of all, about what is a state archive particularly. There's all kinds of organizational archives and company archives, but what is a state archive? I mean, why have one? We think of archives today very much for where you go for family genealogy, for local history, that sort of stuff. But of course, that's not what an archive is designed originally for. The state archive is designed as a working archive for state officials, for court officials, for civil servants. It's where they can go and check, you know, how did we collect taxes 50 years ago? How many schools did we have in 1900 compared to 1950 and so on? It's for the actual operational memory of the state. It normally keeps records on tax, on crime, security, the military, the infrastructure of the state, land, particularly in Ireland, records on land, who had land, who didn't have land, who had land seized from them, who got land back, and so forth. So in a way, the historians like myself and historians all around the place, local historians, people interested in their local area, in their family history, we're all kind of reading the archives against the grain, if you like. We're using them in a way they weren't intended to be used. So it's important to keep that in mind. And also that an archive is, I say, it's not for us, but now it's become for us, for people with a sort of public interest in archives. But a thing that I've really come to appreciate over the years using an archive as a historian myself, and in this project where I'm working alongside archivists every second day, is how much work goes into creating an archive or archiving something. The verb, like an archive, is a place of action, if you like. So it's about arranging and indexing the information so that we can find it. I was thinking the idea of like, it's more than a shed full of random paper. I think a lot of us during lockdown have had a chance to maybe tackle our attics or our sheds or under the stairs. And if somebody said to you, find such a thing in your shed or in your attic or under the stairs, you'd probably have to rummage through the whole lot to find the one thing you're looking for. Certainly that's the case with me. But with archives, they actually work against that trend. They're actually about finding what's in a collection of papers, listing it, making finding aids, making catalogs, making indexes, so that you can call up the exact thing you need. First of all, know it's there, call it up, an archivist can bring it to you, you use it or you read it and you hand it back and it goes back into the same slot again for the next person who needs it. So it's about access and about getting access into the materials. So the Irish story of archives, if that's the perfect archive where everything is understood and findable, the Irish story of archives is a bit less perfect than that. And the big fire in 1922 that we're going to sort of culminate with today is not the first fire in Irish archival history. If you imagine Irish archives go back, I suppose, to the Norman invasions, you're going back to the, 1170s and 80s, or sort of the first records that we have where there's actually kept written records. They were stored, initially, a lot of records were stored from the Court of Chancery, were stored in St. Mary's Abbey in Dublin. And Mary's Abbey was a large monastic foundation between modern, say, Capel Street and Abbey Street, about there where the Lewis line runs through. Mary's Abbey was a substantial stone building, a safe place to keep the records of state, and the fact that it was a monastery just made it an even safer place. It was going to be, nobody's going to attack a monastery. However, an accidental fire burnt down Mary's Abbey and an awful lot of very early medieval records were lost. Throughout the 1500s, there was a bad record of administration of archives, if you like. A lot of archives and records were kept by people who weren't really on top of their game, or they were keeping records as another part of their duty. It wasn't their core role. So when they retired, they took the archives with them, or when they left them to rot in their attic. So there was, corrupt officers were found to be taking archives away and sort of selling them and using them for nefarious purposes. So a lot of archives were moved then into the Custom House, sorry, into the Record Tower in Dublin Castle, and into the Custom House, which was, well, the Customs Office, which was along Dublin's River Liffey, more or less where the Dollard printing works is now, by Capel Street Bridge. And that was seen as being a stone building which was secure. And but of course that too went on fire in 1711. And in 1711, a lot of records of the Privy Seal office were lost. So this was another important office of state. So again, some more stuff was lost there. Then they moved the rest of it into the Birmingham Tower. Excuse me. And the Birmingham Tower, it too went on fire, not completely, but there was a fire within the tower in the 1750s. So there's a constant drip feed of records being lost and repaired and rescued and brought into other buildings. Behind all that, there's a drumbeat of just problems with where they're stored. The records were never kept in the right place. They were kept in buildings that had damp, buildings that had mice and rats. If you imagine, early records were very often kept on vellum or kept on parchment paper, and that is very attractive to vermin and moths, insects, and as I say, rodents. So a lot of these things are getting sort of chewed away. Like history is, if it's not burning, it's rotting and being nibbled at over the course of the centuries. There was an odd tradition with the sort of English administration in Ireland, certainly up to the modern era, where the viceroys or the senior officials, they'd come to Ireland, be sort of sent over from head office in England, if you like. They'd come over and they'd work for a career or for 10 years or for 2 years, do their business in Ireland, whatever they were doing as viceroy or chief of any major office. And when they would finish their time in Ireland, they then return home to England, bringing their records with them as if they were private family papers. So there are substantial chunks of Irish state records from the earlier period, which are in sort of the large family state houses in England and Scotland, where the sort of antecedents would have brought them back in the early modern period. So, and then lastly, just the last point there, thieving scholars. There were, I can't claim that all academics are exactly pure, and there's examples of records being nicked by scholars who are meant to be reading them and studying them, and they would say, oh, I need this important record, I'll keep it, and I'll drop it back into you tomorrow, and of course it never gets seen again. So that backstory is not very jolly, but when we move into by the time we get to the 19th century, the records are getting sort of centralized into three main repositories. That's the Record Tower in Dublin Castle. That's the tower, if you're familiar with Dublin Castle, if you walk into the lower Castle Yard, it's the big dramatic tower you see looking out over the Chapel Royal and the sloping lower Castle Yard. They were also kept in the dome of the forecourts. Actually, in the dome itself, sometimes there were so many records kept there, they endangered the physical structure of the dome. And there were a lot of records kept in the custom house down along the river when the new Gandon custom house was built. But again, these weren't purpose-built, they weren't designed as being repositories for records. The tower itself was a great danger because effectively it had circular rooms with a sort of an open channel running down vertically through the center. So it was like a chimney. If there was a major fire, it would be like the perfect place to lose all your records in one go. So in the early 19th century, in about 1810, well, there'd been a move in England to preserve their records. So the English were aware that records were being lost by sort of erosion, if you like, and drip feed of small fires and things in England. So they had set up a commission to rescue their records and to sort of centralize them. That same administrative mood came to Ireland, and in Ireland in 1810, they set up the Irish Record Commission. And the Irish Record Commission was a group of experts who would track down all the great, most important Irish records going back as far as they could. They would transcribe them, they'd write them onto new paper, they'd print them, and printing them was a way of securing them. So if you take an ancient medieval document that's on a rotting piece of paper, if you transcribe it and print it and you print 1,000 copies, well, if the original gets lost, it's tragic, but it's not the end of the world because you have 1,000 copies out in the world. And their job was to transcribe and print. Hunt down, transcribe and print. And they worked away not very happily together. There was a lot of big egos, a lot of specialisms that clashed, a lot of people who were carping from the outside who wanted to have jobs inside the record commissioners, and people in the record commissioners who were less than efficient, if you like, with taxpayers' money. And by the 1830s, in a government cost-cutting exercise, they closed down the Irish Record Commission. It had not produced all it was meant to produce. They closed it down with some works still in the pipeline that were ready for print, but they were all just shelved and the whole thing was shut down. But just, I mentioned the record commissioners because we'll hear about them later, so just hold them in your head. In the 1830s, it was closed down. 1840s, 50s, and 60s, there was a drive to kind of do something about the Irish records. How are we going to fix this problem of Irish records in scattered locations? So in 1867, there was a new law passed, the Public Records Ireland Act of 1867, and that was to centralise all the records into one new location, into a designed public record office. And what you see here on the screen is a map of the forecourts in Dublin. I don't know if you can see my mouse moving on the screen. This is the River Liffey at the bottom of the screen. The forecourts premises was in a tighter block of land than it is today. Today it occupies like a complete city block, but it had the center part of the block and they extended that to squeeze in. So if you can see this red line around the top left-hand corner, they compulsorily purchased houses and streets around there, and they knocked back and extended the boundary of the forecourts premises and built the public record office in the top left-hand corner, in the sort of northwestern corner of the site. You may not be able to see, but if you can see on your screens, the record office is built in two sections. There's a longer sort of oblong section of building, a small neck of a building, and then a square building at the front. And I'll explain the purpose for that layout in a moment. So this is a modern building with modern legal powers. The Public Record Act of 1867, it effectively made all the records held in all the repositories around the country the property of the Public Record Office. There were particular senior legal officials who were in charge of it, but effectively they were doing it on behalf of the state. So before this time, there had been some officials who'd held records kind of for their own private profit. So you might hold some important set of records, say legal wills or whatever, and you would charge the public a fee to look at these records, and you would pocket that fee yourself, although they were state records, but it was very indistinct in the law as to who owned the access to the records. The 1867 Act made all these records immediately overnight the property of the central repository, the Public Record Office of Ireland, so they could go to all these private holders and say, thanks very much, you're sitting on our records, so you mind them until Thursday, we'll come and get them. Imagine what a task that was to go around all the repositories, not just the three I'd mentioned, but repositories scattered around the country, and count and transport into one central location all these records, sometimes taking them from unwilling current holders. The building itself was a modern purpose-built archive. They're thinking now not like a warehousing, they're thinking in an archival way. They're thinking about structures that are sound for archival repositories. So this is a photograph from 1915, but it's one of the very, very few photographs. Considering this is a substantial building in the middle of Dublin, there are a handful of photographs of it. This is by far the most sort of clear photograph. What you see here is the record treasury to the back, and this is one with the tall arched windows. I'll show you some more photographs of that in a moment. So the treasury is, and they called it from the very beginning, the record treasury, the idea that these are the treasures of Ireland are being kept. So the records are actual treasures, the way we think of museum gold as being treasures today. The front part is this more square building, is the record house, or this is where the staff and the public would go. So the staff and public would go into the front entrance here. If you can barely make out in this window here, I'm circling, there's bars on the window. That was the strong room where if you went in on a Monday and you were reading records and you weren't finished with them, you'd hand them back to the archivist. They wouldn't put them back into the treasury on the right. They would keep them in the strong room overnight and then bring them out to you again the next morning when you returned to continue your research. And this building here had a fire break. So this explains on the map, if you remember, there were sort of two blocks joined by a narrow neck. That narrow neck is effectively a set of double doors coming out of this square squat building, a small metal passageway, and then another set of double doors going into the record treasury. And it was built as an actual fire break. The wall you see here separating them is really a screen wall. There's nothing behind the wall. There's an alley behind the wall. The two buildings don't touch. They, as archivists, as architects say, the two buildings just kiss at one location at the ground floor. And the purpose for that is the front building was a fire risk. In the front building, you had staff who had to be heated by open coal fires. You had gas lamps with open flames. You had readers and staff smoking pipes and cigars and tobacco and so forth. So that was a fire risk. The back building was to be as fireproof as could possibly be made at that time. It was built using the idea of having, well, I'll just show you a photograph inside it. So here's a photograph inside the building. It is 5 stories over stone vaulted basement. The heating is by hot water pipes, like modern heating we would have today, very adventurous for its time. All the light is coming from huge glass ceilings and those tall windows on either side and big windows at the end. So as much natural light as they can possibly have to avoid the need for gas and any other type of false lighting. You can see here, you have the searchers. So this is not a 1950s skiffle band. This is the name of these people who search for your records. So the searchers, they bring the records out from the bays. So the bays behind them are where the records are stored. These are open metal shelves. And you bring the records out and you read those kind of reading shelves along in the overhead light coming down from the central daylight roof. The bays of shelves, the shelves themselves, what they're walking on, the stairs, etc., are all metal to be fireproof. Where they had to use timber, they specifically chose, I think it was sycamore, there's some types of timber that are slower burning and more fire resistant. So they would use fire resistant timber, but in general, in the shelving, all timber was taken out. When we look at the early records of the organization, they're where they have like big shelves for maps that have to come out on rollers, the idea that the rollers would not create sparks. It's all very much about keeping fire out of the premises. And then, I say, having this crucial fire gap between the risky front building and saving the treasury, keeping it separate from the rest. The inside of the reading room, if you went in as Joe Public to read, you went to the reading room here, you would approach this counter, you would sign yourself in, you would order a book using one of these writing desk things here with your pen and ink dip pen here. The archivists behind would check that you'd filled it in right, or they'd help you with your inquiry. And then staff would go out through these double doors here, into the fire break, through the other double doors into the record treasury, fetch the records back and bring them to you, and you would then sit and read here, reading away with the gas lamps overhead, and again more skylights above, just out of shot there. These two gentlemen here are names that we'll come up with later. On the right is Herbert Wood, who is the deputy keeper, so effectively the head of the archives when this photograph was taken, and his assistant D.A. Chart, who goes on to found the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. So these two are two key figures in Irish archival history. So here we have two archivists and their professional staff in a very modern, purpose-built professional building, and they're doing archival things as it is an active place. They have taken in records from all around the country, taken records from all around the city. They produce finding aids for these records. They produce transcripts of records, calendars. So a calendar in archival terms is a brief summary. So if you have a huge volume with many, many records in it, like a volume of say 500 pages, it might be too delicate or too risky to take it out to the public every time it's needed, but the archivists will create a summary of what's on each page, maybe a 2 or 3 line summary, and that finding aid, that calendar as it's called, sits in the main front office here, along with indexes and catalogues and so forth. So they all live in this building, allowing you to find what's in the big building behind. And so that's the kind of work that they're involved in doing. They also publish their work. They transcribe records and publish them. So this idea of if it's available in printed form, well, there's many, many copies in the world. So the one rare original is less of a risk because you have many printed versions of it out in the world. So 1867, right through the 1870s, 80s, 90s, this is operating happily here. The building operates right up until, it's operating again in the start of the First World War, 1914. Some of the staff go off and join the war effort or are recalled to the regiments. And then in 1916, when the rebels take over the various buildings around Dublin city centre, most famously the GPO, but they take over, so what, like, is it about 8-10 buildings around Dublin city centre? The rebels also take the Four Courts complex, including the Public Record Office. So that building is part of the rebel stronghold along the river. It's obviously a strategic point for river approaches and so forth. For a week, there's fighting, gunfire going on around the Four Courts complex and around the record office. Indeed, one rebel is killed inside the record office, so that we know that gunfire is going in. The rebels, they sandbag the windows of the reading room, of the reading house at the front building with volumes of records. So they actually take the big, heavy, these are enormous books, these are books the size of a small coffee table, and they stack them in the windows as defense against incoming rifle fire. And the rebellion goes on for a week. When it comes to the surrender at the end of the Friday, after a couple of days, the archive staff are let back in and they return to an archive which has been the scene of a battle. So you can imagine what it's like. But because of their careful arrangement, their careful listing, their careful understanding of their own archival system, after a few months of restoration work inside, they're able to report that out of the entire week and the occupation and the gunfire coming from inside and outside, that one single document is lost. They can find and reshelve every document or find replacements for every document except one document. I think it was a will from a soldier in the 1850s that they just had no copy of, but they knew they had it and now they don't have it, but everything else was reshelved. So it's a real tribute to their professionalism that they could kind of restore the archive following such a dramatic thing. But another key thing about the 1916 Rising, which was the disaster that didn't happen, if you like, was Herbert Wood, the guy on the right here. He was working away, maybe this very day in this photograph, he's working away on making a listing, a guide to the records of the Public Record Office. So Herbert Woods, he's writing up a guide. It's not quite a catalogue. It's like a list of the major collections and describing what's in them. So it's not down to it's not describing down to the level of a single page what's in the archive. He's describing the major collections that are there. He describes 5,000 collections. So this is quite a nerdy specialist type of book. He has it all prepared. He has sent it to the printers. The printers have made up the lead print. So this is back in the days of lead print, so hot lead print. And it's sitting down in Alex Thom's Printworks in Abbey Street in April 1916. And of course, there's nothing left of Abbey Street at the end of April. There's nothing left of his Printworks. And the whole place is demolished. It's probably the hottest spot. And his lead print just ran down the gutters and melted. But being an archivist, he kept a copy. So it took him a year or two to get his copies back together again. So he did a manual copy. He restructured the book. And by 1919, Herbert Wood's Guide to the Public Record Office of Ireland is produced. This is a hugely important book for us in our project because it's the most comprehensive description so far of what was in the building. It's been described as the saddest book in Irish history because it's it lists the things that are no longer there. So when you read through this book, it's available online. You can see PDFs of it online and comb down through it. And we know it quite intimately now from working with it. But in a way, it looks like a description of a lost world. But all is not quite as bad as it seems. The other thing that Herbert Wood and his colleagues were doing was they were producing an annual report. Every year they produced a report of their activity, what records had come into their building, where they'd shelved them, that sort of thing. They also produced this. This is a plan, if you like. This is a paper schematic of the upright left and right side of the building, the east and west side of the building. So you'll see this is the ground floor along the bottom, the vaults are underneath, and then say here's the third floor, fourth floor. So what you're seeing in the photograph, in the top of the photograph, is approximately what you're seeing in this set of bays here. This is like a little schematic, and it would allow you to see on the whatever 4th, 5th, and 6th floors, you had county records for Armagh and Meath, the census from 1821, law, exchange, pleadings, benchers, building, equity, exchequer, depositions, all these kind of oldie worldly legal terminology. This is where they were stored, and this is where they were all going to be eventually destroyed. But it's important to remember the memory of this institution has been kind of obscured by its destruction. The Public Record Office of Ireland was very successful. It gathered in tons of material. It was seen as by far the safest place, ironically I know, but by far the safest place to store records. So successful was it that many records that were never state records in the first place. So you have things like the Dublin Guilds, the medieval Dublin trade guilds. So these are the forerunners, if you like, of trade unions, I suppose. So you get craftsmen guilds for jewelers, glove makers, cobblers, carpenters. All those guilds had kept the records going right back to the Middle Ages, and they still existed in the 19th century, many of them. They were never state records, they were private organization records, but the keepers of those records felt, oh, it's risky for me to keep this in my guild house or in my home or wherever I keep it. I'll bring it to the forecourts and ask, will they mind it? And they would take it in as an interesting historical document. So you can see in the annual reports, these documents going into the building, which is tragic when you know what's going to happen in a few years' time. Similarly, the Huguenot records. So the Huguenots are French Protestants who were driven out of France by the king in the 1680s, late 1680s. They came to Britain and Ireland, very often silk weavers, sometimes jewelers. So the Huguenot community in Dublin was quite long lasting. A lot of names we'd still hear today in Dublin, and there's a Huguenot graveyard. So the Huguenot records, their own parish, their community records, were also deposited here because these were records going back to the 1690s, and they were worried about them because they were so old. So by 1912, the actual building that we see on the left here was actually becoming full. They were worried that they were actually appealing for more space. So as is the normal case with things like this, you build these things and then rapidly they fill. So it was very successful, doing very well, and as I say, attracting records that was never designed to hold. It was also involved in, I suppose, what we'd call today public outreach. Herbert Wood and his colleagues, they wrote articles in the newspaper, they brought in groups of students, they tried to promote the fact that the archive was here. Herbert Wood described it as an untilled field. He said, we've got so many records here, history students should come and use it, because this habit we have today of going to archives as the public to use them, as I say, this is not what they were designed for, but it's around this time that the interested public are getting interested in it, and the archivists are welcoming them in and trying to encourage them to come in. So this is a successful operation going for 50 years. It's a big boon to the Irish society to have this. It survives through the War of Independence, 1919 to 21. I'll just I'm not going to focus on that today. And then it comes to the start of the Irish Civil War. Now, the Civil War begins, as we know, comes out of the treaty debate and the treaty disputes. There's an entire 12-week module you could do on the Civil War and the origins of it and so forth. But from our point of view, what's important is how it relates to the premises of the forecourts. So on the 8th of April, 1922, so this is Easter 1922, the anti-treaty forces, the forces opposed to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, occupy the Forecourts complex. This is a rerun of Easter 1916. It's happening on Easter weekend, so it's a deliberate rerun, an echoing of the Easter notion, and it's taking the same complex that was taken in 1916, including the Public Record Office premises here. This is a rare aerial photograph. This is taken by the Daily Mirror. The occupation of the forecourts went on for 8 weeks. So this wasn't a sudden rush and battle, an overnight thing. This has gone on for weeks and weeks. The most famous text written about this occupation is Ernie O'Malley's The Singing Flame. And in this, he describes what they do, what we now know as the Record Treasury, which have been called the Record Treasury. The occupying forces, they call that the munitions block, and they use it as a place for assembling the munitions that they're going to need to defend themselves against the expected attack from the National Army or the Free State forces that are gathering outside. And Ernie O'Malley describes the inside of the Record Treasury. He said, it was a jumble of lathes, molds, and mine cases. So this is the equipment they've used to make munitions. Hand grenade bodies lay in heaps. Electric detonators, electric wires, and explosives were piled between the racks which held the records. In the lower rooms, there were explosives, including a large amount of TNT. So this is clearly going to be a risk to the premises here. At the time, the scholars and historians that are working in Dublin knew how important this, knew how significant this was. So they went to Ernie O'Malley, like this was an 8-week-long siege. It wasn't fighting for 8 weeks, it was a standoff for 8 weeks. So scholars went to the Four Courts premises and they said, do you realize what you have are the archives of the nation? And Ernie O'Malley, who was no fool, said, I know exactly what I have. Don't worry, this won't come to blows, and we have taken security precautions. We know this will be all right. They also went to the Free State forces outside and said, you know, what is inside there is the paper treasury of Ireland. It's in great danger, and they were totally assured by the National Army forces that don't worry, nothing will happen. We know exactly what we're doing, and there won't be any danger to the records outside, inside. But of course, once a battle begins, there's no predicting how a battle is going to go. The 8-week standoff eventually heated up to become an actual shooting match, if you like, by the 28th of June. And from the 28th of June to the 30th of June, the Free State forces outside, excuse me, were firing artillery shells in, and you can see damage of artillery shells here on the eastern side of the Four Courts. The Public Record Office is behind the dome. It's sort of out of shot. None of the famous photographs really, or almost none of them, show the actual record premises itself. So the combination of artillery shells coming from outside and TNT and grenade cases from inside was never a healthy one for records. These famous photographs here, excuse me, of here you have the public standing at a safe distance watching. Throughout all of Dublin's rebellion photographs, there's always crowds of people watching these. If it's not 1916 or the War of Independence, they're standing watching battles. It seems to be a Dublin tradition. If you see the dark smoke coming from the top of the dome of the Four Courts, that's legal records that are not the Public Record Office. But the paler smoke, which is showing here behind this church spire, the paler smoke is the smoke coming from the Record Office. We know that from various reasons. About 1 p.m. on the 30th of June 1922, the biggest explosion ever seen or heard in Dublin shook the city centre, and a huge plume of smoke, mushroom cloud of smoke, shot up into the air as books and papers were fired into the stratosphere and then descended, fluttering down on the city like birds, as the commentator said at the time, looked like black and white birds falling out of the sky. Almost immediately, the blame game began. Now, I'm not going to get involved in the blame game. There's been an excellent recent book by Michael Fewer called The Battle of the Four Courts. If you're interested in reading in detail how the propaganda war around who did what to whom and when, that's not what we're about. We're about restoring what was lost. But the blame game began within a day as to who was to blame for this. But just to show you some photographs here of the damage on the day, or of the battle. Here is an excellent photograph of the skyline during the battle, or just after the explosion. This is a photograph taken from the south of the river. The Liffey is kind of hidden between the buildings. So if you like, here's the dome of the Four Courts. The river is running left to right here. This is Nelson's Pillar in the distance here on O'Connell Street. And what you're seeing here on the left is the roofless, the tall arched windows of the Public Record Office and the white smoke pouring out, and then the Four Courts Hotel in the foreground here. So you can sort of locate where the building, where the premises was. The records that were blown into the sky got caught in high currents of air. They were blown out as far as Howth Head, all over the city centre, and out into Dublin Bay. So, they were truly scattered. The destruction inside the Four Courts complex was tremendous. Here you can see again the iconic arched windows, the amount of destruction inside within the Four Courts complex itself. That's just the roof of the Bridewell Garda station in the background, and the Lewis line runs along the back there. The Deputy Keeper's report, the annual report the next year. Imagine every year they're writing a report and saying what they're doing. This year they'd write a report which says basically there's nothing left. The fire left little but tangled ironwork, blocks of masonry, and the charred fragments and ashes of what had once been the public records. And here you hear the photograph in the Evening Herald showing it's almost like somebody's constructing a framework, whereas in fact it's deconstructing. When I see this photograph, I can imagine the heat of the fire melting the metal shelves and the walkways, and them buckling and sort of cascading, pouring their records down into a central inferno below. Some more photographs as the clearing operation began, like into July and August of 1922. So that's all the bad news. People at the time were looking for scraps on the street. These are photographs of people picking up fragments of records. There was a public appeal to the people saying, if you have fragments, please bring them in. We can possibly do something with them. Very, very little was handed in. I suppose it's the middle of a civil war. It wasn't a time for doing your civic duty. And if you found a bit of a medieval scrap on the street, you might keep it as a historical souvenir or artifact, but they haven't been handed in. Very few things got handed in. So that was, and then following the end of the Civil War, of course, the state was getting on with building a new state. So the new archives, the archive had very little time to recover before it had to start dealing with the administrative needs of the new Irish Free State. But not everything was completely lost. You remember I told you that the building had 5 stories over stone vaulted basements. Some records in the basement were baked rather than being burnt. They were singed rather than being totally incinerated. And at the time, in 1922, when they emptied out the vaults, they found bundles of these records. They were very badly singed, as you can see from the photographs here, but they thought, well, maybe in the future, the right technology, the right techniques, the right money and time will all come together to allow us to do something with these records. So they boxed them up and carefully put them away, and the National Archives of Ireland held them until now. And then in a recent drive, starting about 2 years ago, the Irish Manuscripts Commission, which is a cultural wing of the state, looking after old records and sort of preserving old manuscripts of all sorts, Gaelic manuscripts, poetic manuscripts, literary manuscripts. The Irish Manuscripts Commission has paid for the conservation effort in the National Archives of Ireland, where Zoe Reid, the senior conservator, has unboxed these records, begun to re-identify them. If they can be smoothed or saved and opened or rescued in any way, that's fine. If they're sort of less badly damaged, the ones that are pure ash, again, go back in the box, but at least we know what they are. And so they're slowly coming back to light. The more savable ones, salvageable ones of these are coming back to light. But this collection of the salved records is a very exciting part of linked into our project as things that actually made it out of the building. The other important survival was, if you remember, I said the front building survived the fire. So this was an interesting, the record treasury at the back burnt entirely, but the reading room, the bit where the staff and the public would go, the fire break worked, but in the wrong direction. The ammunition and so forth was stored in the record treasury. It completely destroyed. But the fire break saved the front office, the administrative block. In the administrative block is where they kept the indexes, the catalogues, the finding aids, those calendar books I told you about. And so here you can see one of these books, a transcript book with a shrapnel wound. This is a bullet wound in the book. There's a number of these books in the National Archives, and these are part of the salvaged collection of records that made it out of the building. And the third exciting thing, of course, is Wood's Guide. Wood's Guide has survived because it was published and is out there in the world, and that allows us to begin our work on Beyond 2022. So our project is aimed at tracking down every possible transcript, copy, calendar, index, anything we can find relating to the records that have been in the building, making a full list of everything that was in the building, a full list of everything that we can find, and to create a 3D virtual reality model of the building so that you can sort of put on your goggles and go back inside and experience the building, but also find the records that are scattered around the world, find the copies and transcripts. We began in a small scale way seeing, well, is there anything there to be found? We rapidly found there's lots to be found. So in fact, we're coming across copy records in locations across Ireland, North and South, across Britain, Europe, and North America. We've built a 3D model. You can get a sense of this on our website. I'll give you the link at the end. That sort of, you can sort of see inside the building. This is our virtual reality reconstruction. So this, when I saw this photograph first, I actually thought it was a color photo taken before they stocked the shelves in 1867. But this has been made by our creative team in Beyond 2022. And you see here the open work of the shelves, the amount of daylight there is coming in with no books or records on the shelves. So this is what we're trying to virtually fill. This is a VR model. This is not a genuine, like a tangible thing. As I say, we're tracking down copies, transcripts, and summaries of wills and letters just by detective work. Imagine you have a big Irish Department of State that's writing across to head office in London all the time. So over the centuries, over decades, there's letters and correspondence to and fro between London and Dublin. Everything that comes into Dublin is stored in the record office and is lost in 1922. But all the letters out from Dublin have survived in London. So they can tell you half of the story. They can tell you what was being talked about. They can talk about the important files. They can give you information about the contents of the Public Record Office. In many important offices of state, they would have made manuscript longhand copies of extensive ranges of records that were held in the Public Record Office, and those have survived. You might remember we had, we talked about the Irish Record Commissioners, that sort of group of, let's say, big ego guys that were shut down in 1830. It turns out that a lot of the work they had got ready to go to print was just shelved. The records became scattered, they were sold off, they became part of family property. Those now are emerging. We're finding those in, we're not finding, but archivists and librarians have secured them and preserved them. So we're able to go around the archives and discuss with archivists what's in their holdings and begin to identify these things as these are part of, like here you have, for instance, Inquisition's post-mortem for County Cork. An Inquisition post-mortem is a big landowner dies and the state moves in to say, right, what's going to happen to the land, who's the inheritor, and if there's no inheritor, the land goes to the crown. But this is from the time of Queen Elizabeth, so this is from the late 1500s, but the paper and the writing is from the 1820s. So it's a copy made in the 1820s of a much earlier document, which has been lost in the fire. But this copy has survived in the Royal Irish Academy Library. And in the Royal Irish Academy, there are many, many volumes of these. Overall, we're finding over 200 volumes, and volumes are quite substantial chunks of writing, with hundreds of thousands of pages of 19th century copies of much earlier records that have been secured. I mentioned the Huguenots. These are the French Protestants who were refugees in Dublin. The Huguenot records were lost in the fire in the Public Record Office, but some scholar had gone in and made a copy. In 1915, he made a copy of some records here, and when he finished the copy, he had it at home, and then the fire happened, and he wrote in his own copy. So here is a copybook from 1915 or 16. He's written here what it is, that it's a copy of certain parochial records of the Huguenot records that were in the Public Record Office, and then the same guy who wrote it out returns after the fire in 1922 and writes in his own book in his own bedroom, whatever, this book was destroyed in the Great Fire in the Record Office. And he's deposited this in Marsh's library. So this one copy, and we know this exact book, original, was on one shelf in the Public Record Office of Ireland. Similarly, there was a scholar doing a lot of work into doctors, Irish medical men, and Sybil Kirkpatrick did a lot of work on Irish doctors' wills, going right back, wills going back to the 1690s, 1700s, 1800s, and she had many, many copybooks of these wills, which all the originals were lost in 1922, but she would go every day to the record office and study away and make transcriptions of wills. Inside some of her copybooks are the actual call slips that she used, and they're tucked inside, and you see here Sybil Kirkpatrick, Lower Baggot Street, and she's looking for a particular will from 1732. And these are all stored in the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland. So again, small bits and pieces coming from different directions all the time. I imagine many, many wills in solicitors' offices all around the country probably. Here we have one of the wills. What you can find from wills, not just the money and the fact that the person is dead, but a bit of social history. Here we have in somebody's will saying, my will is that my interment should be private and in the night time. Now, we're all too sadly familiar with private interment under the current circumstances, but this notion of social history, that burials by night, something we wouldn't think of today, but that this person had specifically asked for a burial by night. So what you can get reading against the grain, looking at records in ways that were never particularly intended. The Irish Record Commission dealt with a huge range of dates. Here we have one guy reporting on his work in 1816, and he's done transcripts. He's made transcripts of records from the 1270s right up to the 1590s, and they're all out there for us to hunt and track down. The originals all lost, but these copies scattered in repositories around the world. Similarly, before the record commissioners ever came along, other scholars made copies. Here's one, I just love this one because the date is so early. In the 1740s, Walter Harris, who's a scholar, either he himself or one of his paid scribes, sat down with records going right back to 1291, going back to, like, this is sort of Norman times, and made a copy. This copy of the record from 1291 survived, written in 1740, survived and was, it was held by the Royal Dublin Society Library. They then donated it to the National Library of Ireland when the National Library opened. It's manuscript number 1 in the National Library of Ireland, and it exists in the National Library's collection. But it's copying material which was in the Public Record Office of Ireland. So up to 1922, this was just like, hey ho, it's an early copy, not so important, but the original is still down the river in the forecourts. When the original is destroyed, this suddenly is elevated in its importance. But the fact that this guy sat and wrote this, and he had in front of him a document from 1291, I don't know, it pleases me very much. Here we have, where is my cursor gone? But you've got the other problem with large extensive amounts of manuscripts. If you have tons of records written in manuscript, finding stuff within them is, you know, it's tricky. You need to have more than just like the index in the book. If a modern reader wants to read stuff online, if we scanned and digitized all of these, you just get a huge tranche of scanned images, and to find anything in them is quite tricky. So they have to be transcribed, they have to be made readable in some way. It's easy enough to take a printed document and to OCR it, as they call it, optical character recognition. You see, we do it online all the time. But for handwriting, you have to transcribe it. Very expensive, very time consuming. We could not possibly afford to do it. Fortunately, in another part of the forest, a completely different project called Transcribus or Transcribus was being developed in Austria. It's an EU-funded project to do computer-generated handwritten text recognition. So you train the computer to read particular handwriting you're working on if you have a large collection, like many volumes of the one hand, and it can then produce machine-created transcription to a very high level of accuracy. So this is suddenly producing for us many millions of words we can now find the words in handwriting, put them through the Transcribus process, and get a searchable transcript that can then be displayed on screen when our project has reached fruition in June 2022, which is the centenary of the destruction. The advantage of that, of course, is that, well, it makes it so much more searchable, but the computer programming is so clever, so smart, not my department, I'm a historian, but it can even find those misspellings. Say, for instance, the word Galway. We all know we spell Galway in one way, but standardized spelling wasn't a big thing back in the early times. So you have Galway with a double L and a V, Galway with a double L and a W, but the computer can be programmed to look for all the variants. So you put in Galway and you get everything that thinks it's Galway will come up in your search. And that makes for a much more powerful search across all these records. It can also make for a very intelligent search. This is a typed transcript. I think this type transcript is from the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, and the transcript of a religious census in 1766, where they were tracking down all the established Church of Ireland people, all the dissenters, Presbyterians, and all the Papists or Catholics in every part of the country. Many of these records have still survived from 1766. And they have in here, like names of places, names of people are visible down at the end there when you run it through Transcribus. We are capturing these people and place names and putting them into a huge, it's a knowledge base, but like a sophisticated database, which will allow you to search. Imagine you go into the Public Record Office with your virtual reality headset on, and you look for Ballyfermot and Palmerstown, and it brings you to this record here on a shelf, and you're standing virtually at that shelf, and you say, show me every other mention of Ballyfermot in this building, and you turn around and look into the building, and these lights go off in all the different corners of the building, and it could be land in Ballyfermot, or an army base in Ballyfermot, or it could be a monastery at any point in history. So it can we can link names, place names, person names, and facts across all time once we can amass all these words in a digitized way. So that our computer science side, it's history and archivists and computer scientists are doing all this kind of work to make for new ways of searching the information, so we can do more than you could have done before the building actually burnt down. So whatever we find will be more accessible than even before when the physical records were destroyed. The amnesia of where the building was often amazes me. This premises is forgotten now. This is the forecourts if you're driving from the north to south, from left to right in the picture here. Behind the picture here is the Bridewell. Just out of shot on the right is the River Liffey, and the Lewis line is behind the building. This modern 3 strips of sort of 1970s or 80s office block is sitting on top of the basement floor of the old Public Record Office. The front record house has survived, and that's now one of the courts of appeal. But the notion that the building has been forgotten from public memory, a major building in town, and its work has been forgotten from public memory, and considering it was a memory institution, so that's kind of ironic in a way. So we're hoping to address that as we move towards the centenary and launch our free to access public resource, which will be more than a website. This will be a searchable resource. You can access it in all sorts of ways through the VR headsets. You can access it as from school kids or genealogists, family historians, local historians, professional scholars. The thing is state funded, so it has to be free access to all. And if you want to hear about some of our more recent sort of findings, on the 30th of June this year, so each 30 June, we're trying to do something to focus on the date. So 30 June 2022 is the centenary. 30 June this year, we're doing an online thing as part of the lockdown response, I suppose, an online event called Unlocking the Archives. This is a free online lunchtime event on the Tuesday the 30th, and then an evening discussion. The lunchtime showcase will have members of our team talking about the technological advances they're making and some of the records they're finding and why they're important. The evening discussion will have some historians and archivists talking in a sort of broader level about the activity that we're doing and how it fits in a broader international basis. Follow us on Twitter or check out our website, and I'll leave it there if Ben wants to jump back in. Thanks, folks.
That was absolutely fascinating. That really, the comments are coming in here publicly and privately. I think people are actually blown away by the fact that they hadn't got a clue that this was going on. You know, something it's such an iconic part of the history, but like people, the amount of comments coming in here saying, I just can't believe I haven't heard about this. You know, it's a fascinating project to be involved in, it must be.
It is absolutely fascinating. It's like my dream come true, to be honest. I mean, I sometimes pinch myself and think, how did I land on my feet in this job? But the fact that people don't know about it is, in a way, when we have to put our hand up and say that our fear at the beginning was to overpromise, to say we're doing this thing, and people who say it can't be done, and what if people were right? So we've been taking a very slow approach. We've been, like, I started in it in 2016. Excuse me. I started in 2016, and Peter Crooks is the leading principal investigator behind it. And Peter, sort of, when he put me onto it, it was a matter of try to find a bit, try to find something. And the more we found, the more viable it looked as an idea. And then the more archivists we spoke with and librarians we spoke with, the more stuff started coming out of the woodwork. So we're now beginning to kind of sort of educate the people of what we're at, so that they can know when the centenary comes, that they'll know what it is they're getting, rather than just land on them on June 2022. So this is the beginning. In a sense, you're the first public outing, I suppose. So well done you for inviting us.
It's more than a pleasure, I can tell you, Ciarán. I really, you know, when you're into the whole history, you know, either it's archaeology or whatever, and you get that feeling that you're witnessing something special. You know, that gut feeling you get. It really seems tonight that like a lot of people seem to be like, someone just dropped a comment there saying, "Oh, I can't believe he stopped talking. Why has he stopped talking?" You know, they could listen to you for the rest of the night. Like it must be, someone's brought it up there actually, saying it must be quite an emotional element to it. I know you're looking at it from the factual, historical side of things, but there must be an emotional element to it for you and for everyone involved.
There is. It's funny you should say that about the emotional thing. For me, this is kind of one of those anecdotal stories, but I think it sort of says something. I can remember, so I wasn't always working in history. I worked in industry for years and was a mature student going to college and did my doctorate late and all that kind of stuff. But I was always interested in history. So in my teenage years, being a nerdy boy, I remember going to Dublin City Archives and Library, and I was looking for something about my local history, where I come from. And I looked for some particular record, and the librarian said, "You won't find that because that was lost in the forecourts in 1922. And I said, "What's the forecourts in 1922? I was probably 17 years of age. And he said to me, he gave me the potted story of this disaster. And it always stuck with me, thinking, oh my God, if only I'd lived before 22, I could have found out all this stuff. But now it's invisible to all of us. And then in this strange way that your careers and life moves, and here I am, I mean, literally probably, I don't know, 40 years later, coming back and working on this project to find this stuff. But the enthusiasm behind it, and when we speak with librarians and archivists, and we're partnering with sort of large and small archivists and librarians from all around the country and all around Britain and North America, very often we start with them and we say, this is what we hope to do. And they'll say, that's very brave, it's not really possible. And we talk around, we give examples of the type of stuff we're looking for. And then very often, a week later, they come back and they say, do you know what? We do have some scholar left papers in here in the 1930s, and he had been doing research in Dublin in the 1910s, and we think there's some stuff in the copybook. And we'll record it and we'll try and find it. We can't afford to scan everything, but we go in, we record what's there, we jot it down, and we sort of amass that, we add that to our list of stuff. We had a very interesting find, which don't tell anyone, it's only between us guys, right? We had a very interesting find in the National Archives lately, where they have some administrative records that are not available to the public yet, administrative records from the Public Record Office, and it's their increment book. It's the recording of what has come in, what was coming into the record office every year in detail. So it's like the manifest. A lorry drives into the record office with all the stuff from the Court of Appeal, and somebody writes down exactly what's in it and what shelf it goes on. So we're now getting to a really fine-grained list of what was in the building and where it was shelved. So we'll be able to say to people, we found, you know, let's say the whole shelf, and we found nothing on that shelf, but we find one copybook one will in a solicitor's in County Cavan, and we can say that will was on floor 7, Bay 6, shelf 93, and we know it is exactly there, and we can now replace that one stitch in the whole fabric of the whole thing. So it's stitch by stitch is how we're doing it.
That's incredible, though, isn't it? I mean, that really is fascinating stuff. I mean, that's mind blowing. It's almost like it's too good to be true. Almost when you hear stuff like that, you know, that you're getting that level of detail for something that was considered to be lost to the ages.
Yeah, absolutely. You know? The one question that I'm possibly someone's going to ask it somewhere, I don't know, but the notion of how much can you find? And then any time I've spoken to public groups about this, they will say, how much can you find? And again, it's a bit, how long is a piece of string? Because we have to establish exactly what was in the building. It's very hard to predict how much we can find. But I think, I mean, considering that everything was believed to be gone, we're possibly aiming at like 20-25%, that sort of thing, if we do really well. But that in itself, from a base of 0, and considering what the wealth and stuff that was there, it's a great leap forward for us. We'd be delighted with that as a sort of a final figure. But it'll roll on. I mean, like, there'll always be more stuff coming in. People are coming to us with suggestions all the time.
And that's some of the questions that were about, was actually what the target, and it's great that the target, and especially 2022 as well.
Yes,
it's a fantastic way to market. And there's a lot of people here asking, is there any way that they can get involved with you or help out in any way? I don't know if there is there?
That's something we're looking at. So part of the, there's a lot of this, what they call like citizen science or crowdsourcing stuff, projects in various parts of the digital world. Part of our issue at the moment is just not having the staff to cope with a public outreach on that scale, but it is something that we'll work towards. So I'd urge people to either follow us on Twitter or check in. I mean, we'll be getting more public going forward from now, but there will have to be some crowdsourcing, like that type of engagement there as time goes on, because it's A, we can't do it all on our own, but B, the amount of knowledge that's out in the community. If I was doing this in the parish hall anywhere in Ireland, somebody would walk up and tell me a fact I don't know, and it'd be the same in this gathering here for sure. So there, at this moment, no, we don't have we don't have the staff to maintain that, but do keep an eye on that space, because that's something that I'm keen to do, to some kind of citizen science or crowdsourced connection.
Well, you definitely have a few volunteers there putting their hand up.
Thank you very much, folks. Appreciate it.
There's a few. I'll give you 5 or 2 more questions that I hear here on.
Sure, please, don't work away.
Where were the records of the Irish House of Lords deposited? Was it in the Dome or in the PROI?
House of Lords. They would have gone into the PROI eventually. Actually, sorry, I tell you, the parliamentary, so the bound volumes of the Irish House of Commons and Irish House of Lords were in the PROI, and now I'm going to do this from memory. There was a fascinating project done by a chap called Philip Maddock, who is interested in, everything is somebody's specialism. Philip Maddock is a wonderful guy interested in bookbinding, and the Irish House of Lords records were bound in absolutely spectacular red leather bindings. These books were huge. The books were like 1 meter tall and 3/4 meter wide, and there was hundreds of them, and they were done with gold leaf embossing and beautiful things. So his interest was, somebody had taken black and white rubbings, like, you know, you do as a kid, doing rubbings of a brass plate. Someone taking rubbings from these books before the fire. Philip Maddock tracked down the book covers, the rubbings, and he got a toolmaker's bookbinder specialist to make reproductions of these. So if you check, there was an exhibition in Dublin Castle, but Philip Maddock, Dublin Castle book bindings, will probably find it. But sorry, they were stored in the Public Record Office of Ireland. The contents of them were, I think, are available. They've survived in printed form, but they're a thing where we actually know what color they were. So in our visualization, we'll be able to say that shelf was bright red with lots of gold on it.
Oh, that's incredible. That really is, isn't it? And even when you showed that the mock-up there, the inside of it there, when you were looking at it,
I know.
Really, with empty shelves, like, that's so emotive, isn't it? You know, they're just waiting to be filled.
Filling. When I've tried on the VR goggles a bit. It's interesting. We went quite far down the road with VR goggles, and then COVID came along. So we were doing road shows and saying to people, try on the goggles, and everybody's sharing goggles, and suddenly that's all blown out of the water. So we have to think about how we do the VR experience, the virtual reality experience. But on the goggles and step inside the building was, as you said, emotional. You look up and you look inside and you see these empty shelves like it's 1867, and you're thinking, no one alive has seen this until now.
Yeah, that's the bit that came into my head. I was thinking it must be a fantastic feeling just to know that, you know, that this is totally new, you know.
Yep.
And you can see there's a few people saying they're intrigued by the technology of it. There's a lot of people kind of, wondering transcribus and things like that, how all of this has come together. And, is this kind of a technology that's either been that you've kind of tried to push forward, that you've developed, or it's been there already, that's kind of come to your aid?
Some of it is it's a combination, a bit of both. The transcribus thing was happening quite unrelated to us. So when we began, transcribus wasn't ready to be launched. We were working without transcribus being a reality. It came on, it emerged independently, and we now are a member of the transcribus consortium. But it emerged about a year into our scoping phase. But the other, our project is based in the history department in Trinity and the computer science department in Trinity. So computer scientists are on the ground from the very beginning. So we had an idea, and we said to them, this is a very complicated database. I could bore you for Ireland on the complication of the database, but basically you could have imagine a volume that was sitting on the shelf in the public record office, and it was a volume of 500 pages sitting there. And some copies were made of the first 50 pages, and they're in Dublin. Some copies were made of the next 50 pages, and they're in London. And then 3 loose copies were made of the last 10 pages, and they're in Philadelphia. The original book is burnt. We have to track down the remnant bits in scattered locations, bring them back together, and present them to you, the user, so that you say, I don't want to know scraps. I want to know there was a book all in one lump. I want to see it together in one lump again. So you have to digitally stitch it back together again, while being loyal to the fact that Philadelphia have preserved it, and Dublin have preserved it, and London have preserved it. So you have to acknowledge their archival work. So the database of meshing all those things together is mind-boggling. But I sit in on technical meetings and I nod like I know what they're talking about, but they're doing amazing things in computer science with this. And the knowledge base will be transformative.
And I have to, Ciarán, you're getting so many coming in privately and publicly here just about the way you've delivered it.
Oh, keep going. I'm happy to keep talking.
Yeah, no, they genuinely, they could have listened to you all night long, and they're trying to get onto Twitter and trying to follow Facebooks and things like that. So you've definitely got a following here, and future down the line, anything that comes up, especially with the definitely stay in touch. We'd love to kind of get it out there.
Love to come back on board and keep you guys posted. Yeah, absolutely.
We'd love to have you back, because it really genuinely, it's been a fantastic evening. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I really, really have. And thanks so much for coming along and doing it.
Delighted to get it. I just happened to see Zoe Reid, who is the Senior Conservator of National Archives of Ireland, popped up there somewhere. So the next time there's an open house on or a culture night on, if ever that comes back to that stage and you're in Dublin, go and see the National Archives of Ireland. And if you get a chance to go inside Zoe's conservation lab, it is my favourite place in the world to look at things returning from the ashes. It's amazing.
That's fine. Yeah, I'll definitely take that one up. It's fantastic, absolutely fantastic. So many lovely comments coming in, Ciarán. You really have.
Thanks, folks. I'm really delighted.
You've done the project justice now. I mean, I'm thrilled that it's gotten out there. I really am. It's absolutely fantastic.
Well, perfect timing, the invitation. Really, I know it's the Mutual Admiration Society with Ben. It was exactly the right time for us to announce this amount.
Excellent. That's great, Ciarán. Listen, really look with us, but that was absolutely fantastic. That's it. Tonight, lads, from Trust Natira, that was one of the best ones we've had in a long time. That was fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed it. We have a few ones coming up now over the next couple of nights. Tomorrow night with the 1798 Battle of Antrim by Stephen McCracken. The 8th, we have the Lieutenant General Joe McKelvey by Jim McVeigh. And on the 9th, we have Charles J. Kickham and His People by John Birmingham. So there's a few nights planned for you there. You can dip in and out as you will. We're all the way up, all the way through June. And definitely check out Beyond 2022. It's definitely a project. Everyone check it out. Spread the word. It's something I think as Irish people, definitely it deserves a huge spotlight. It's absolutely amazing. Gurmila Malco, Ciarán. Slán, lads.
Slán, cheers.